the other guests. Laura needed to get away from the city, the hustle and bustle, the endless work days, and the stress had begun to take their toll on her. Anxiety had become part of her routine, and she could barely remember the last time she had gotten a full night's sleep. She decided that the best thing to do would be to take a break, to get away from it all. On the recommendation of a friend, she booked a week at a mountain inn, an isolated place in the middle of a snowy landscape where the only sound to be heard was the crunch of snow underfoot and the icy wind blowing through the trees. The place was perfect. Upon arrival, Laura was fascinated by the inn. It was an old building, built of stone and dark wood, with windows that offered a spectacular view of the snow-capped mountains. Despite its somewhat desolate appearance, the interior was warm and cozy. The fireplace in the lobby burned with a constant fire, and the rustic wooden furniture gave the place a homely feel. The innkeeper, an older woman named Sophia, greeted her with a kind smile, though there was something in her gaze that made Laura uneasy. Maybe it was tiredness, or perhaps the loneliness of the place, but she couldn't help but feel that there was something else behind Sophia's hospitality. "Welcome," the woman said as she handed her the key to her room. "I hope you enjoy your stay. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask me." Laura's room was on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway. The place was larger than she expected, with a wide bed, a window overlooking the snowy forest, and a small wooden desk in front of the fireplace. There was an air of tranquility in the room, and Laura felt like she could finally relax. However, as she placed her things in the closet, Sophia reminded her of something peculiar. "There is a small rule at the inn that all of our guests must follow," she said in a soft but firm voice. "You must not open the door to your room after midnight." Laura frowned at the warning. She had heard all sorts of strange rules in some rural lodgings, but this one seemed excessively mysterious. Still, she nodded, not giving it much thought. "And why is that?" she asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Sophia looked at her with a seriousness she had not shown until now. "It's for your safety," she answered, without further explanation, before turning and disappearing down the hall. Laura thought for a moment, but soon shook her head. She was not here to worry about strange rules or local superstitions. She had come to relax, and that was exactly what she was going to do. After a long hot bath and light dinner in the small dining room, she decided to go to bed early. The accumulated tiredness of weeks without rest enveloped her, and as soon as she rested her head on the pillow, she fell fast asleep. The first day at the inn was as uneventful as she had expected. She woke up late, enjoyed her coffee in front of the window, watching the snow fall softly, and then went for a walk around the grounds. The nature was stunning, and the cold mountain air cleared her mind. The night came quickly and darkly, and after a light dinner, Laura felt more relaxed than she had in months. However, that night, shortly after midnight, she suddenly woke up. The clock on the bedside table read 12:30. Her heart was pounding, and she didn't know why. She sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort that had woken her. That was when she heard footsteps. They were light, almost imperceptible at first, but then they began to sound more clearly in the hallway just outside her door. Laura thought maybe it was Sophia or some other guest. However, the footsteps stopped right in front of her room, and the sound was replaced by a soft knock on the door. Knock, knock, knock. Laura tensed. She remembered Sophia's warning. not to open the door after midnight. Her first impulse was to ask who was there, but something in the stillness of the hallway and the darkness she felt beyond the door dissuaded her from doing so. The knocks were repeated, this time more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was soft but disturbing. She clutched the sheets to her body, trying to convince herself that it was just someone wrong or a stray guest. Yet there was something about that knocking, something that made her feel that opening the door would be a terrible mistake. The minutes passed, and after a long, tense silence, the knocking stopped. Laura heard no more sounds that night, but she barely slept. And when she did, it was a light, restless sleep plagued by nightmares she could barely remember upon awakening. The next morning was cold, the sun barely peeking over the mountains, and the atmosphere in the inn seemed heavier. Laura decided she had to talk to Sophia about what had happened. She found her in the dining room, serving breakfast to the few guests who were also there. Was there anyone walking through the halls last night? She asked, trying to sound casual as she picked up a cup of coffee. Sophia looked up slowly, her face as expressionless as ever, but her eyes shining with a hint of worry. No one should have been out of their rooms at that hour, the innkeeper said calmly. I hope you didn't open the door. Laura shook her head, though the memory of the knocks still made her uneasy. What if I do? She insisted, unable to contain the question. Sophia put the teapot down on the table and leaned towards her. It's better not to find out, she replied quietly. Before turning to another guest who had just entered, she hadn't gotten any concrete answers. But what was clear was that the warning wasn't just a meaningless superstition. That night, Laura went to bed earlier than the day before, determined to sleep without incident. However, just as she was falling into a deep sleep, something woke her up again. This time it wasn't footsteps, but a soft whisper, as if someone was whispering just on the other side of the door. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were barely audible, but enough to fill her with a sense of impending danger. She tried to concentrate, to try to understand what they were saying, but the words were incoherent, a constant murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Laura, the sound of her own name among the whispers paralyzed her. This time it wasn't a mistake. She was sure someone or something was calling her from the other side of the door. Fear gripped her. She remembered Sophia's words and forced herself not to move, not to make a sound, not to open the door. Yet the whispering continued, more and more insistent, more and more disturbing. Finally, the whispering ceased and was replaced by something much worse. A loud, determined knock on the door, a knock that echoed through the room, making Laura almost jump out of bed. Bam, bam, bam. The knocks shook the door, making it vibrate on its hinges. It was as if something, or someone, was desperate to get in. The knocks continued, louder and louder, until Laura, completely terrified, ran to the bed and covered herself with the blankets, as if that would protect her. After what seemed like an eternity, the knocks ceased again. Silence filled the room again, but this time it was not a peaceful silence, but one charged with an evil presence that Laura could feel, even if she could not see it. It was several minutes before she dared to move, her body shaking. She stood up and slowly approached the door. She pressed her ear against the wood, trying to hear any sound, but all there was absolute silence. She didn't dare open the door, not that night. The next morning, she went down to the dining room, determined to confront Sophia again. However, The innkeeper was not there. One of the employees informed her that she had left early to do some shopping in the village. This was unusual, but Laura couldn't wait. She decided to explore on her own and talk to other guests. However, when she tried to converse with the others, she received evasive answers. Some seemed nervous. Others simply ignored her. It was then that she began to suspect that something much more sinister was going on at this end. That evening, while looking through some books in the main hall, Laura found a small notebook hidden in a dusty bookshelf. It was an old journal with yellowed pages and covered in dust. Opening it, she discovered that it belonged to a former guest who had stayed at the inn many years ago. The journal spoke of an experience similar to her own: strange noises at night, knocks on the door, and a warning not to open it after midnight. The scariest thing was what she read in the last entry: "Those who open the door are never the same again." The journal ended abruptly, and Laura felt a chill run down her spine. That night, she decided it was her last at the inn. She could no longer ignore the strange occurrences, and the sense of danger that enveloped her was growing more intense. She went to bed early, but kept all her lights on, determined not to let fear control her. Around midnight, as on previous nights, the knocks on the door returned. This time they were more violent, more desperate, as if whatever was on the other side knew she was about to leave. The knocks became so loud that she feared the door would collapse. Bam, bam, bam. Laura sat up in bed, completely paralyzed. But this time she wasn't going to just wait. She stood up, and her heart hammering in her chest, walked over to the door. Just as she was about to put her hand on the knob, the knocks stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and for an instant she thought maybe it was over. But then the doorknob began to turn on its own. Laura stepped back, horrified. She walked in, and she had ignored all the signs. Without thinking, she stepped back and stared at the door, her mind racing to find a way out. The door slowly opened, and a chilly air filled the room. From the threshold, a figure emerged from the gloom. It was a dark and distinct shadow, with vague outlines that moved as if it were made of smoke. Laura could make out no human features, but the feeling that something evil was there was undeniable. The figure stood in the threshold, staring at her, though she could not see its eyes. Laura felt it was watching her, assessing her fear. "Laura," the figure whispered, its voice a mix of distorted echoes and worn whispers, as if it were speaking from a far distance. Horror washed over her. She remembered the journal she had found, the warnings not to open the door, the fate of those who had disobeyed. Without thinking, she backed away even further, trying to get away from the door, but she realized she had become trapped in her own room. The figure took a step forward, and the chill of the freezing air intensified. Laura desperately searched for something to defend herself, but all she had was a small vase on the nightstand. Before she could think of what to do, however, the figure spoke again. "Release me, Laura," it said, and the voice sounded like a wail, as if it were trapped in endless suffering. Laura's eyes filled with terrors, although she knew she shouldn't let herself be overcome by pity. A part of her wanted to help this entity, wanting to understand why she was trapped, but the other part of her knew it was nothing more than a trap. "No," she managed to say, her voice shaking. "I can't help you." The shadow seemed to lean towards her, as if her answer had hurt it. However, it instantly stood up again, its presence becoming more menacing. "You don't understand," it said, almost like a menacing whisper. "You're not alone here. You are not alone." Laura felt a chill run through her body. The words echoed in her mind as she realized that the figure was not just talking about her. Something inside her told her that there were more people trapped in that place, more guests who had fallen victim to the same trap. In an act of bravery and desperation, Laura took a step back towards the window. If she managed to open it, she could escape. The figure, seeing her movement, lunged towards her with terrifying speed. "Don't go," she shouted, and the echo of her voice reverberated in the room. Laura felt the air become dense, almost as if an invisible hand was holding her. However, she could not allow that to stop her. With a quick movement, she pushed the window open and managed to open it wide, letting in a freezing wind that almost pushed her back. "Help!" she shouted, peering into the abyss of the night, where the snow fell in a chaotic whirlwind. The distance to the ground was considerable, but the alternative was even more terrifying. The shadow followed her, coming ever closer. With a final cry of determination, she threw herself out the window, landing in the soft snow that cushioned her landing. The cold surrounded her, but the adrenaline kept her moving. She quickly stood up, feeling the stinging pain in her limbs, and ran into the woods, away from the inn. As she ran, the shadowy figure fell behind, but she knew she was not safe. The echoes of its voice continued to resonate in her mind, mixing with the whispers of other guests who had once been there. "You are not alone here." Laura continued to run through the thick snow, wishing the darkness of the forest would protect her. However, when she looked back, she saw shadows moving through the trees, figures that seemed to be about to reach her. She kept running, trying to stay calm, until she saw a light in the distance. It was a small shelter that she had missed during her arrival. Without a second thought, she ran towards the light, knowing that she could find help there. When she reached the shelter, she pushed the door with all her might and found herself in a warm and cozy space. It was a small wooden chalet with a lit fireplace and comfortable chairs. Inside, there was an older man with a gray beard and a calm look, who quickly stood up when he saw her enter. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Laura could barely speak, her chest rising and falling rapidly from the run she had made. "There's something at the inn," she managed to say between gasps. "I can't go back. I can't go back." The man frowned, as if he understood more than she was telling him. "Sophia, the innkeeper, right?" the man said, and Laura nodded, feeling fear invade her again. "You are not the first to flee that inn." Laura looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to assimilate his words. The man approached her, and his expression turned serious. "That inn is a cursed place. Those who do not follow the rules, those who open the door after midnight, become part of its history. There is something trapped there, something that takes forms and plays with the minds of the guests. I have seen many get lost in the darkness, in the cold of the night." The man's words echoed in her mind. Was it true? Was she also destined to become one of those shadows, one of those figures that haunted others? She felt helpless, a prey to the fate that had brought her to that inn in the first place. "And what can we do?" she asked, feeling tears well up in her eyes. The man stared at her and then walked over to a bookshelf full of antique objects. He pulled out an old book covered in dust and carefully opened it. "We must perform a ritual," he said. "We need to break the connection that keeps those souls trapped, but it won't be easy. We must do it before midnight strikes again. Laura couldn't believe what she was hearing, but she knew she had no other choice. Time was running against her, and if she didn't do something soon, the fate she had feared could come true. The two of them set to work preparing for the ritual. The man explained that it was to be an act of release, an attempt to return the trapped souls to their eternal rest. They used candles, salt, and herbs that the man had collected from nature, while reciting words in an ancient language that Laura didn't understand. The atmosphere grew increasingly heavy, and the candlelight flickered as if responding to the energy of the place. As the ritual progressed, Laura felt the dark presence begin to surround her, like a vortex of shadows threatening to devour her. Yet, deep inside, the spark of hope kept her going. She thought of all the people who had been trapped there, of the other guests who had suffered the same as her. She knew she couldn't give up. Finally, as the clock struck midnight, the ritual reached its climax. The man raised his voice in a powerful shout, and Laura felt something in the air change. Shadows began to swirl around them, and an echo of voices rose, screaming and lamenting for their freedom. Now the men shouted. Laura closed her eyes and focused on the candlelight. She imagined the trapped souls, willing them to find their way to peace. At that moment, a bright light emerged from the center of the circle, illuminating everything around them. The shadows began to scream, but not in fear. It was a sound of release, an echo of years of suffering finally fading away. Laura opened her eyes and watched as the shadowy figures dissolved into the air, leaving behind a trail of bright light. For an instant, she felt all the trapped souls join her, thanking her for her bravery. As the last echo faded, a deep silence filled the shelter. Laura dropped to her knees, exhausted but relieved. She had managed to free those who had been trapped in the end, and in the process had saved her own life. The man, still standing, watched Laura with a mix of awe and respect. "You have done it, child," he said in a deep voice. "You have freed the lost souls. But be careful, evil always finds ways to return." Laura nodded, feeling the weight of his warning as the first light of dawn began to filter through the shelter's windows. A palpable peace enveloped the place. She had accomplished what many could not, and although she knew that danger could lurk around any corner, her spirit felt light. "Thank you," she whispered, and the man smiled knowingly. "Now you must leave before they return," he replied, indicating the door. "The end can no longer hold you, but its shadow will remain. Never forget what you experienced here." Laura left the shelter and entered the forest. The cold enveloped her, but her heart beat strongly. She had faced her fears and had emerged victorious. As she walked, she realized that the path back to the inn no longer seemed terrifying. What had been a place of torment became a memory, a warning about the shadows to lurk in the darkness. As she emerged from the forest and saw the sunrise over the mountains, she knew she was ready to leave the past behind and face a new future.